When I first pulled into the gas station, it didn't look like much. The place sat alone on a stretch of highway that seemed forgotten. The sign above the pumps had missing letters, leaving only Star Gas to glow faintly against the night sky. A single car idled at one of the pumps, its driver slouched in the seat, waiting for the tank to fill. The air felt heavy, almost still. No crickets chirped, no cars passed. The only sound was the low hum of the station's old lights. I parked my car and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. This was supposed to be a new job, a fresh start, but something about the place felt wrong. I shook it off. Maybe I was just nervous. It was my first night, after all. My last job at a gas station hadn't exactly been glamorous, but it wasn't haunted either. I grabbed my bag and stepped out. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and something stale. As I walked toward the store, the ground beneath me crunched. Not gravel, but something else. I glanced down to see shards of broken glass scattered near the pumps. They caught the dim light, but there was no sign of a broken bottle or window. The door to the store had a bell that jingled as I pushed it open. Inside, it was just as quiet. The space was dim, lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs that cast long shadows on the walls. Rows of shelves stood neatly stocked, but there was an air of neglect. Ads taped to the windows were faded, colors washed out by years of sun. A faint smell of old hot dogs lingered, the kind that had been under a heat lamp for far too long. I paused by the counter, setting my bag down. A laminated note taped to the register read, "Back in 5. Before I could process that, I heard footsteps. An older woman appeared from one of the aisles holding a broom. Her hair was pulled back, and her face looked kind but weary. She waved at me as she approached. "Alex, right?" she said. Her voice had a warm rasp, like someone who'd worked long hours for most of her life. "I'm Anne. My husband did the interview, but I'll be training you tonight." I nodded, unsure how much to say. Anne didn't seem like someone who liked small talk. She gestured toward the counter. "Go ahead, put your things back there," she said. "We'll do a quick tour before I leave you to it." "You've worked at a gas station before, yeah?" "Yes," I said. "A couple of years." "Good," Anne replied. "Then I won't bore you with the basics." She motioned for me to follow her. We started with the cleaning supplies. Behind a door marked "Employees Only" was a narrow closet crammed with mops, buckets, and cleaning chemicals. The air inside smelled strongly of bleach. "Bathrooms next to it," Anne said, tapping the doorframe as we passed. "Just a single stall, nothing fancy, but keep it clean. Customers complain about that more than anything else." I glanced inside. The bathroom looked rough, scratched walls, a stained floor, but it smelled clean, at least for now. Anne moved quickly, almost briskly, leading me back into the store. She stopped by a shelf lined with security monitors. "Cameras are a little old, but they do the job," she said. "You'll spend most of your time at the register or walking the aisles. Stay active. A busy store feels safe. That's important at night." I nodded, noticing the screens. Most of the cameras seemed to show odd angles. Pavement between the pumps, a corner of the parking lot. Only one gave a clear view of the gas pumps themselves. Anne reached into her pocket and pulled out 2 laminated sheets, one yellow and one bright red. She held the red one up. "This," she said, tapping the red sheet, "is your Bible for the night shift. Follow these rules exactly, and you won't have any trouble." Her tone sharpened, her eyes locking on mine. "And I mean exactly," she added. "No shortcuts, no exceptions. Got it?" I nodded again, feeling the weight of her words. Anne handed me the sheets and glanced at the clock above the counter. "I've been working nights here for years," she said, her voice softening. "But it's getting harder for me to stay up that late. You're young, you'll be fine." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "We've had some trouble keeping people on the night shift. Not everyone can handle it." "Why's that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Anne hesitated. "You'll see," she said. After Anne left, the station felt emptier. The silence pressed in, broken only by the faint hum of the lights and the occasional creak of the building settling. I set the yellow sheet aside. It looked like a basic list of cleaning tasks, and focused on the red one. The instructions were printed in bold black letters, precise and direct. Rule 1. A clean store is a safe store. Stay busy and visible in the lit areas of the store. Rule 2. Turn off half the store lights at 10 p.m. Keep one half lit for the rest of the night. Rule 3. At 12:05 a.m., mop the refrigerated drinks aisle for exactly 20 minutes. Do not leave the aisle or stop mopping during this time. Rule 4. Use headphones to block out noises during the mop task. Ignore anything you hear. The list went on, but the rules started to feel strange. Most were about cleaning and staying active, but some felt off. Why the specific time for mopping? Why the headphones? The last few rules were even stranger. Rule 8. If you see a shadowy figure outside on the security monitor, stay out of view and wait until it disappears. Rule 9. Do not leave the store during your shift. I glanced at the monitors. The gas pump stood empty, bathed in the dim light. A lone moth fluttered near one of the bulbs. Rule 10. If all shadows in the parking lot face the store, lock yourself in the employee room and shut off the lights. Wait until morning. My stomach tightened. I read the last rule again, trying to make sense of it. What did shadows have to do with anything? I set the sheet down and rubbed my temples. This had to be some kind of joke, right? A prank to scare the new guy? The clock above the counter ticked louder than before. Or maybe I was just noticing it now. I glanced at it again. 9:57 p.m. 3 minutes until I had to turn off half the lights. I stood and walked to the light switch panel. My hand hovered over the switches as I stared at the store. The aisles stretched into the dim corners, rows of snacks and drinks neatly arranged. Everything looked normal, but it didn't feel normal. With a deep breath, I flipped half the switches, plunging one side of the store into shadow. The first hour of my shift felt like any other late-night job. The store was quiet. Too quiet, really. I stood behind the counter, pretending to read the laminated red sheet again, but my mind wandered. It wasn't the silence that bothered me. It was the rules. I kept glancing at the clock, trying to figure out if it was off or if the minutes were moving slower than they should. The sheet had said to stay busy, so I grabbed a mop from the closet and started on the aisles. The first aisle was easy. Chips, snacks, nothing out of place. The second aisle was the same, though I noticed a faint stain on the floor near the end. It looked like oil or maybe grease. I made a mental note to come back to it and moved on. That's when I heard it. A noise. Soft at first, like something shifting, then a faint drip, drip, drip. I turned toward the sound, but the store was empty. I could see the parking lot through the glass doors. No cars, no movement. Still, the sound persisted, coming from somewhere behind the shelves. I followed it cautiously, my shoes scuffing against the floor. When I rounded the corner, I saw it. A puddle. It wasn't water, though. The liquid was dark, almost black, and it seemed to shimmer slightly under the dim light. It didn't make sense. The floor here was clean just a few minutes ago. I backed away, my grip tightening on the mop handle. The rules hadn't mentioned anything about puddles. Then there was another sound. This one was faint, almost like someone whispering my name. I froze, listening hard. It was too soft to make out, but it sent a chill down my spine. I forced myself to move, shoving the mop into the water and scrubbing furiously. The puddle didn't seem to shrink, but I kept at it, hoping that whatever this was, it wouldn't get worse. When I glanced at the clock, it was almost midnight. My hands trembled slightly as I rinsed the mop in the bucket. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared, and I hadn't even reached the worst part of the shift yet. The red sheet had been very specific. At 12:05 a.m., I was supposed to mop the drinks aisle. I had read the instructions a dozen times, trying to find a reason for it, but there wasn't one. Just a rule. I wheeled the mop bucket to the back of the store, my steps echoing louder than they should have. The drinks aisle stretched in front of me, lined with glass doors and bottles of soda. It looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The clock on the wall ticked over to 12:05. I dipped the mop into the soapy water and started swiping it across the floor. The first few minutes were fine. I moved back and forth, watching the mop glide over the tiles. But then I felt it. Something in the air shifted. It was subtle, like a change in temperature or the way the hairs on the back of your neck stand up when you're alone in the dark. I didn't stop mopping. The red sheet had been clear. I couldn't leave the aisle, no matter what. So I kept going, trying to focus on the rhythm of my movements. Then came the urge. It started as a small thought, a whisper in the back of my mind telling me to leave. To drop the mop and run. It didn't make sense. There was nothing there, nothing to be afraid of, but the feeling grew stronger with every second, pressing down on me like a weight. My breaths came quicker, my hands clutching the mop tighter. The whispering started again. This time it was louder, closer. It sounded like someone standing right behind me, just out of reach. I refused to turn around. The rules had said to act normal, to keep working, so I did. I kept mopping, even as my knees started to shake. Finally, the clock ticked to 12:25. I stopped moving, gripping the mop like a lifeline. The whispers faded, replaced by a deafening silence. I dropped the mop into the bucket and backed out of the aisle, my chest tight. Whatever had been there, it was gone. For now. Back at the counter, I tried to catch my breath. The cameras were right in front of me, their screens casting a faint glow. Most of them showed the usual, empty aisles, quiet pumps. Then one of the screens went black. It was quick, a flicker of static that lasted less than a second. But when it came back on, there was something there. A figure. It stood near the farthest pump, a dark shape against the pale light. I couldn't make out any details. No face, no features, but it was there, unmoving. I froze, my eyes locked on the screen. The red sheet's words came rushing back to me. If you see a shadowy figure, stay out of view. My body moved before my brain could catch up. I ducked beneath the counter, heart thudding in my chest. My fingers fumbled for the compact mirror Anne had left behind, tucked in a drawer next to the register. I held the mirror at an angle, just enough to catch the reflection of the camera feed. The figure was still there. It hadn't moved, but it was staring directly into the camera, as if it could see me through the screen. I waited. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the silence pressing down on me. Then, without warning, the figure disappeared. 1 second it was there, the next, it was gone. The camera showed an empty parking lot. Nothing out of the ordinary. I stayed under the counter for a while, my hands gripping the mirror tightly. When I finally stood, my legs felt weak. I thought the worst was over, but the night wasn't done with me yet. It started with a whisper, soft and familiar. "Alex," it said, drawing out my name like a question. I stiffened, my hands tightening around the edges of the counter. The voice sounded like Anne's, but it was off, too distant, too hollow. "Alex," it called again. This time, it was closer. I told myself to ignore it. The red sheet had said to act normal, to stay busy. So I grabbed a rag and started wiping down the counter, my movements mechanical. The voice didn't stop. It called my name over and over, growing louder with each repetition. Then I heard it, clear and sharp, directly behind me. "You forgot something." I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. The store was empty. But something caught my eye, a crumpled piece of paper lying on the floor near the register. I picked it up, my fingers shaking. It was one of the laminated sheets, torn down the middle. I looked around, my breath catching in my throat. The cameras showed nothing. The aisles were still. But I knew I wasn't alone. When the sun finally rose, it didn't feel like a relief. The dim light creeping in through the store's windows didn't wash away the weight of the night. I had survived, but I didn't feel safe. The moment Anne walked through the door that morning, her expression told me she knew something had happened. She glanced at me, then at the counter, and then at the laminated red sheet lying torn on the floor. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, but there wasn't any humor in her voice. I stared at her for a moment, unsure how to start. The words came out in a rush. "What is this place?" I said. "What was that thing I saw last night?" Anne didn't answer right away. She bent down to pick up the torn sheet, brushing it off as if it were something fragile. Her silence made my stomach tighten. "Anne," I said again, my voice firmer. "I saw someone or something outside. It was watching me. And then the whispers, it sounded like you." She sighed, setting the sheet on the counter. "I told you to follow the rules," she said quietly. "I did," I replied. "But you didn't tell me why. You didn't tell me what happens if I don't." Anne looked at me, her tired eyes heavier than ever. For a moment, I thought she might brush me off again, but then she nodded toward the break room. "Come on," she said. "We need to talk." The break room was small, just a table and 2 chairs squeezed into the corner. Anne sat down, gesturing for me to do the same. "I don't like talking about this," she began, her voice low. "But I suppose you deserve to know." She leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant. "This gas station isn't like others," she said. It's been here for a long time. Longer than me, longer than my husband, and for as long as anyone can remember, it's had visitors. I frowned. Visitors? Not the kind you're thinking of, Anne said. Not people, at least not anymore. I didn't say anything, waiting for her to continue. When my husband and I took over this place, we didn't know anything about it, she said. His father ran it before us, and he always told us to follow the rules. But he never explained why either. We had to learn the hard way. Her voice faltered, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something vulnerable in her expression. My husband broke a rule once, she said. It was a small thing. He forgot to turn off the lights in the back half of the store. He thought it wasn't a big deal. What happened? I asked. Anne closed her eyes for a moment. When I found him the next morning, he was sitting in the break room, shaking like a leaf. He said something had come into the store, something he couldn't describe. It didn't touch him, didn't hurt him, but when the sun came up, he couldn't see anymore. His eyes were fine. Doctors couldn't find anything wrong, but he's been blind ever since. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. And you kept working here? Anne shrugged. We didn't have much choice. This place, it doesn't let you leave that easily. Her words sent a chill through me, but I pressed on. What about the voices? The whispers? It sounded like you, Anne. How is that possible? She hesitated, then shook her head. That's not me, she said, but it knows how to trick people. It uses voices, faces, anything it can to get what it wants. That's why the rules exist. They keep it at bay, most of the time. Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I couldn't let it go. Anne's explanation answered some questions, but it left me with even more. I needed to know what I was dealing with. After my shift ended, I went home and started digging. It wasn't hard to find records on the gas station. It had been around for decades, changing hands from one family to the next. But there wasn't much about the visitors Anne had mentioned. Then I stumbled across a name. Fred. It was buried in an old newspaper article, one that had nothing to do with the gas station at first glance. The story was about a man named Frederick Harlan, a truck driver who had disappeared near the station in the early 1970s. According to the article, his truck was found abandoned at the pumps, but Fred himself was never seen again. The details were vague, but it was enough to make me suspicious. I kept digging, piecing together fragments from different sources. Fred wasn't just a truck driver. He was also rumored to have a violent streak. There were whispers of arguments with his family, of debts he couldn't pay. The last piece of the puzzle came from an old police report. It mentioned that Fred had been seen arguing with the station's owner on the night he disappeared. Witnesses claimed he was shouting about being cheated, that he swore he'd make them pay. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. Fred hadn't just disappeared. Something had happened to him that night, something the station had buried along with his name. I thought back to the red sheet, to the rule about the shadows in the parking lot. It wasn't just about keeping the store safe. It was about keeping Fred out. But why? What had happened to him that made him this? I returned to work the next night, armed with my newfound knowledge. Anne was already there, her expression unreadable as she handed me the red sheet. Did you sleep? She asked. Not much, I admitted. I've been doing some research. Her eyes narrowed. I told you not to dig too deep. I needed to know, I said. About Fred. Her face darkened, and for a moment I thought she might refuse to talk, but then she sighed, leaning against the counter. Fred wasn't always like this, she said. He was just a man, angry maybe, but human. But something happened that night, something we don't fully understand. What do you mean? I asked. Anne hesitated, choosing her words carefully. The station, it has a way of holding on to things, she said. Memories, emotions, people. Fred's anger didn't disappear when he did. It stayed behind, and over time, it became something else, something that doesn't let go. Her words sent a chill through me. And now he's part of the station, I said. Anne nodded. He enforces the rules, keeps things in balance, but he's not the only one. There are others, things that come and go. Fred's just the most persistent. Her voice trailed off, and for the first time I saw fear in her eyes. What happens if the rules aren't followed? I asked. Anne didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. You don't want to find out. she said. The air inside the gas station felt heavier than ever. This was my place of work, my supposed refuge, and yet it had become a prison. The fluorescent lights above flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows across the aisles. I'd been here every night for weeks, following the rules to the letter, clinging to the belief that obedience would keep me safe. But now, staring at the laminated red sheet, I knew the truth. The rules weren't about safety. They were about control. Fred was the enforcer of that control. Tonight, I was going to confront him. My hand shook as I reached for the red sheet taped to the counter. Rule 1. Never say his name aloud. My voice quivered as I spoke it anyway, louder than I'd intended. Fred. The response was instant. The overhead lights stuttered and died, plunging the store into near total darkness. The generator's faint hum became the only sound, underscoring the suffocating silence. Shadows crawled along the walls, twisting unnaturally, as if the store itself were alive. Then came the scraping, a low, deliberate noise emanating from the stockroom door behind me. My heart raced, but I held my ground, gripping the counter for support. "I'm done playing by your rules," I said, forcing the words past my fear. The scraping grew louder, closer, and then the door creaked open. He stepped into the dim light, his figure massive, cloaked in a shroud of darkness. His eyes burned faintly, twin embers of malice. Fred didn't speak, but his presence said everything. I had broken the rules, and there would be consequences. Fred's form loomed closer, each step deliberate and filled with menace. The air grew colder, and it felt like the walls were pressing inward. I backed away, my hand brushing against the lighter I'd stuffed in my pocket earlier. It was a meager defense, but it was all I had. I flicked the lighter to life. Its small flame illuminated the oppressive shadows, and for the first time, Fred hesitated. The darkness around him wavered, recoiling from the light. "You don't control me," I said, my voice firmer now. "Not anymore." Fred surged forward, shadowy tendrils reaching for me. I grabbed the can of lighter fluid from under the counter, spraying it in a wide arc as I struck the lighter again. Flames roared to life, creating a barrier between us. Fred's scream was a guttural, inhuman sound that reverberated through the station, shaking the shelves and rattling the glass doors. The fire spread quickly, the heat searing my skin as I advanced. Fred's form twisted and writhed, his features dissolving into the darkness that birthed him. But even as his physical presence began to fade, his malice lingered, a suffocating weight in the air. Finally, with one last anguished cry, Fred disappeared. The station fell silent, save for the crackle of the flames and the faint hum of the generator. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Grabbing my bag, I bolted for the door. The cool night air hit me like a wave as I stumbled into the parking lot. My car sat where I'd left it, a lifeline in the chaos. I climbed inside and started the engine, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. As I pulled out onto the empty highway, the gas station receded in the rearview mirror, its faint glow barely visible against the dark horizon. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. But as relief began to wash over me, a chill ran down my spine. Glancing in the rearview mirror, I froze. Fred was there, standing at the edge of the station's light, his form still and unyielding, his eyes burning faintly in the dark. He didn't move. He didn't need to. His message was clear. Some curses aren't meant to be broken. I gripped the wheel tighter, forcing myself to look away. The road stretched out before me, empty and unforgiving. I had escaped, but I knew better than to believe it was over. Fred was still there, spying, anticipating. And the gas station wasn't finished with me yet.